Hello all, my name is Jonathan Hood, and today I'm going to be presenting on air pollution and the law. To do this, I'm going to be covering several topics, of which the first will be where I place definitions. Then I will move on to the Environmental Protection Agency's major areas of concern. Following that, I will then discuss the history of and evolution of federal laws regarding air pollution, after which I will then discuss current laws, both the federal and the laws for the state of New Mexico. Then, finally, I will cover future actions that might be in store for our country. The definition of air pollution at the federal level, as defined by Title 42, Chapter 85, Subchapter 3, is defined as basically any air pollution. Air pollution is any agent that's emitted into the ambient air. New Mexico, under Title 20 State Code, states that air pollution is any emission that is not naturally occurring in the outdoor atmosphere and may cause harm to humans, animals, or plant life. They also have another definition for air contaminant. And air contaminants are defined as any airborne substance like particle matter, fumes, gas, vapors, or any combination of these items that combine to cause air pollution. The Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, has 5 major areas of concern. The first area of concern is common pollutants, which covers ground level ozone, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, lead, and nitrogen dioxide. The second area of concern is about air toxics, which are toxic chemicals, including formaldehyde and polychlorinated biphenyls, which are PCBs, which are released from industrial facilities. The third area of concern is on acid rain. The EPA's focus is about reducing emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides that mix to combine the acid rain. The fourth area of concern is about ozone layer protection. It originates from chemical reactions between oxides of nitrogen and volatile organic compounds, VOCs, that cause damage to the ozone in the upper atmosphere. The fifth area of concern is regional haze, and this is taken as part of air quality indicators, which are placed throughout the country. Now, we move on to the next topic of the history and evolution of the federal laws. It all started with the Air Pollution Control Act of 1955, which was the first federal legislation involving air pollution. It provided means for funding for federal research on air pollution. Then, the Clean Air Act of 1963 was established, and it was the first federal legislation regarding air pollution control. It authorized the research under the U.S. Public Health Service into techniques for monitoring and controlling air pollution. I would also like to note that it was monitored under the U.S. Public Health Service because the EPA at the time had not yet been established. The Clean Air Act of 1973 was a large, brand new base of legislation that authorized the development of comprehensive federal and state regulations to limit emissions from both stationary industrial sources and mobile sources like vehicles. It created multiple regulatory programs, the most substantial of which was the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, known as NAAQS, and this was when the EPA was established on December 2nd, 1970. Then, in 1977, amendments were created to the Clean Air Act, which delivered control of non-attainment areas, which are basically areas that did not fall under any current federal air quality standards. The last and final of the amendments to the Clean Air Act occurred in 1990. It substantially increased the authority and responsibility of the federal government. It also authorized the control of acid deposition, or acid rain, and the issuance of stationary source operating permits. The National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants regulation from 1970 was also greatly expanded for controlling toxic air pollutants. Now we move on to the topic of current federal laws. Obviously, we have discussed that at the federal level, there was the Clean Air Act, which was the comprehensive federal law that regulates air emissions from stationary and mobile sources. Inside of the Clean Air Act were congressional findings. There were 4 of them. These 4 findings are what give the legal precedent for there to be regulations for controlling and reducing the amount of air pollution. The first one is summarized as major population areas are generally large urban centers that tend to cross state boundaries. The second was that growth and complexity of the pollutants were a growing concern for public health and welfare. The third finding was that air pollution prevention and control at its source is the responsibility of state and local governments. And the final one was that federal financial assistance and leadership are important for all levels of government to prevent and control pollution. Now, New Mexico, the state of New Mexico, under Title 20, broke out areas of responsibility into 3 separate jurisdictions or categories. The first one was the Air Quality Bureau, which is responsible for the entire state of New Mexico, except for Bernalillo County and the tribal lands. The second area was the City of Albuquerque Air Quality Division, which is responsible for air pollution control in their county. It is the only urban area in New Mexico that requires emissions tests, and this was because in 1995, this area was failing the air quality indicators that were being tested in that area. Because of this, they've had to place further restrictions to reduce the amount of air pollution coming from that city. The third area of jurisdiction for the state of New Mexico is on tribal lands, which is governed by the EPA for anything that's concerned relating to air pollution. Now we must discuss future actions. Why is air pollution a concern? There are 2 reasons why it's a major concern. The first is that public health and welfare are at risk with the unhealthy environment the air pollution is creating. The second is that it causes and increases the rate of climate change. Climate change affects not only the world, not only the United States, but also the world. There are multiple effects that it has, but just a few examples are that the ocean levels are rising, which is flooding cities. There's desertification of the Great Plains, and generally speaking, we are seeing many more weather patterns which cause greater acts of God that cause loss of life and greater amounts of property damage. In an effort to reduce climate change, the world leaders got together to agree on reducing amount of emissions. This conference was called the Paris Climate Change Conference of 2015. At this conference, President Obama signed the document stating that America would try to reduce its obligations within the set timeframe. To achieve the goals set by the document, strict regulations and changes must be put in place, or else we will not be able to achieve the reduction of our air pollution in time. The EPA reacted by establishing regulations that required electrical companies to transfer power generation from coal to renewable resources by 2030. If these companies were to transfer this power generation, they would reduce the overall amount of air pollutants that the country emits by 1/3 by 2030, excuse me. But because of how extreme these new regulations were, the Supreme Court ruled that these regulations must be temporarily halted so a cost-benefit analysis could be performed. The analysis could be extended until September 2018. The Supreme Court's decision will determine how all future air pollution regulations are created and accepted, which will ultimately determine the theme in which our country reduces air pollutants and decreases climate change. In closing, I thank you for your time.